Just stay where you are, everybody. Okay. So, how many of us here remember this guy? Anybody recognize that face? The name? You would probably recognize the voice more than you would the name. It's Paul Harvey, and he used to have a radio show called The Rest of the Story. And I'm going to play this here. And I chose, I went online to see what different clips they had from this old radio broadcast. And I chose this one. It has a very special significance in my own personal life. And my wife will probably catch it. If she listens carefully, you'll figure it out right away. And then you'll have to ask her after the service, what was so significant about this? But anyway, okay, so just listen to the rest of the story.
Now, the rest of the story. It was just a spring exhibition baseball game in Florida's Payne Park, an exhibition game between the Boston Red Sox and the Milwaukee Braves. They used to say that Payne Park was rightly named, at least from a batter's perspective, because it was a big ballpark, a most difficult one in which to hit a home run. Anyway, the Sox and the Braves were going at it that day. Pitching for Boston was a fellow named Ike DeLock, right-hander. Nothing spectacular, pitched a lot of fastballs. But let's pretend we're watching a movie of this game, and let's run it fast forward so that we can freeze on one frame. It shows Ike on the mound, and the Braves rookie, the rookie second baseman, at the plate. The second baseman with the bat poised above his shoulder is barely 20. He has been called promising, but then a lot of rookies get called promising. But anyway, on this perfectly ordinary day, in the middle of this perfectly ordinary preseason game, the young second baseman is facing DeLock, and Ike DeLock winds up, and the pitch is a screaming fastball, Ike's specialty. Had it been a curveball or a slider, any other pitch, baseball history might now read differently, but it was a fast ball. And the young second baseman uncoiled with a crusher. I don't know if you know, but that's the thing about a fastball. Combine the speed of the ball with the speed of the swinging bat, and they connect solidly, then that ball is gone. The Braves manager, Charlie Grimm, couldn't get over it. Almost 400 feet to that long left field fence, and the rookie second baseman had sent the ball over the fence and into the trailer park beyond. It was only a preseason game, insignificant, almost every way insignificant, except this is the rest of the story. The Braves manager, Charlie Grimm, had been counting on a recent trade acquisition of his team, a big hitting outfielder named Bobby Thompson. But then right before the opening game of the season, Thompson broke his ankle. Well, that left a gaping hole in left field. There were at least 2 or 3 other players who might have filled that position. But manager Grimm, recalling that one stunning, super long, preseason home run by that young second baseman, chose that young man. And the rookie would always be certain that one home run was the reason he stayed with the Braves. And eventually, he was to hit more home runs than anyone in Major League history. I said eventually, he was to hit more home runs than any other, ever. And now you'll remember the day it all began, in March of 1954, for a rookie who was then faltering as a second baseman, a young man named Hank Aaron. Hank Aaron. Now you know the rest of the...
I don't know why I cut it out there, but anyway, it did that. But okay, so how many of you remember that radio broadcast? Not that particular one, but the rest of the story. Remember listening to it. Okay. Yeah, well, so Paul Harvey would tell an interesting tale, giving just enough detail to get your interest in it. Most of the facts were probably unfamiliar to the audience, and then right at the end of the broadcast, which was about 5 minutes long, he would give a piece of information so that everybody knew what the rest of the story was. It was enough to fill in then all of the gaps. Well, we've reached the point in the story of Ruth now where all of those pieces come together. The book ends with the words that let us know why this is such an important story. And so as we complete our study of the book of Ruth, we're going to find out just exactly what is the rest of the story. Now, we've already talked enough about it. You probably already know the clincher anyway. It's no secret. I don't have to give a spoiler alert because we've talked about it. But really, that's kind of the way the book of Ruth was written. It was written in the same way Paul Harvey would have written the rest of the story, because the last few verses then fill in all of those gaps, and suddenly you know why did we hear this story in the first place? Why it is so important. So in chapter 4 of Ruth, we get the conclusion of what has happened. So we had Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons going to Moab because of the famine in Bethlehem. Then they, of course, Elimelech and the two sons die. Two sons married while they were there. They married Moabite women. They weren't supposed to leave Bethlehem in the first place. They weren't supposed to marry the Moabites. They did all of those things against God's will. Then Naomi decides to go back, and one of her daughters-in-law decides to stay. The other one goes with her, which is, of course, Ruth. They get back to Bethlehem. Everyone greets them. They're surprised. Ruth realizes we have to do something now to meet our needs. So she goes into the field, which was the way that in Israel at that time they cared for the poor. They could go, they could glean the grain that was left behind from the harvesters. She would get enough, and then she catches the eye of the owner of the field by the name of Boaz, a righteous man, and he gives her a little special attention. And then Ruth goes back and mentions that to Naomi, and Naomi says, "Wow, don't you know he's one of our relatives? He is a near kinsman," which for them meant he would be able to redeem them back. As we find out in the 4th chapter, nowhere else is it mentioned, they actually had some land that must have been mortgaged away, that they no longer had control of. And so Naomi's thinking, wow, this guy is going to take care of all of our problems. So she tells Ruth to get all gussied up, go and hang out at his threshing floor, and after he's a little bit drunk, then take the covers off his feet, and he's going to know that there's somebody there. He's going to see you, and he'll get your attention, and maybe that's what it's going to take then to have this, to get him to be the kinsman redeemer. But then he sees Naomi. He's impressed with her. He wants to be that kinsman redeemer and to take her as his wife, to marry the near close relative that will take care of the widow of a deceased member of the house of Israel. And so in the process, though, he's aware, of course, Bethlehem's a small town, he's fully aware that there is someone else who by rights is related closer to Naomi and Elimelech than he was, who would have the first rights, the first dibs, so to speak, on being able to be that redeemer. So Boaz, being a righteous man and following all the rules, he realized that he has to now go to this other individual and give him the opportunity to be that kinsman redeemer, to redeem Naomi and Ruth and the land that had been mortgaged when they left Bethlehem. Left Bethlehem to go to Moab. So Boaz, we are told at the beginning of the chapter, went to the city gate, which was the public place where business transactions were conducted, so that there would be plenty of witnesses, because this is where they would buy and sell land, they would redeem the slaves, they would do all these things. And so you want to have a lot of witnesses so that nobody can come around later and say that it didn't happen. Everybody saw this transaction, so they did it in a very public place there at the city gate. Boaz waited for the man who had the first rights to redeem the land that belonged to Elimelech, who was the husband of Naomi. who had died in Moab, waited for him to come along, and then he was going to give him the offer, let him know that here were this woman who had land that needs to be redeemed, that they had a responsibility as the kinsman redeemer. This was an obligation that they were supposed to fill in Israel as part of the law. Boaz told him then, and this is just where it comes out for the first time in the whole story, that there was land. And the man kind of perks up, because I'm sure he's thinking, wow, I could use some more land. I would be able to get that and use that. Now, granted, it's the legacy of someone else, but still I would be able to benefit from that. And so he gives him the offer, and initially this unnamed individual agrees to be the redeemer. However, then Boaz tells him, oh, by the way, there's something else that goes along with it. There's a woman who will become your wife. And then he has to think about it a second time. And he's not quite sure then if he wants to go ahead with this transaction. He decided that he could not be the redeemer. And the reason he gives is because he said it would damage his own inheritance. Now, there's a fair amount of speculation as to why this unnamed man refused to fulfill his responsibilities as the kinsman redeemer. One author suggested it was because Ruth was a Moabite, and he was aware that the Israelites were forbidden to marry the Moabites. He didn't want to get into this relationship with a foreign woman, and perhaps it might drag him away. That's one idea. Probably the most likely explanation, however, is that this near kinsman already had been married and had grown sons of his own, and if he had married Ruth, it would cause problems with the inheritance that he would leave for his own sons, because then what happens is this is the legacy, and the children that come from that marriage from Ruth then really become the legacy of Elimelech. And so it was a little bit of a confusing situation there, and he decided he didn't want to mess around with what should have been the legitimate legacy of his own children. He didn't want to have more children with another woman and from another wife, and or from another husband whose legacy he was continuing. And so he just said, I can't do this. And so he uses the words, I can't do it, but it may be more likely he's saying, I don't want to do it. I don't want to go ahead with this. The text says that his response was that if he redeemed the land and married Ruth, this would ruin his own inheritance. At any rate, the nearer relative did not redeem the land for Ruth and Naomi. And as a result, the next person was able to fill that role, and that was Boaz. And he was more than willing to do this. He wanted to do this. This was exactly what he was hoping for, but he was following the rules and following the law and giving this man the opportunity that he was entitled to. Now, when we read about how this transaction was made official in the community, the other man, really, he did not fulfill his responsibility as the kinsman redeemer. And it says in verse 7, it explains that there was a custom in the land of Israel, and actually this was part of the law. Back in Deuteronomy 25, we see a fuller explanation of what they were supposed to do. When he refused to fulfill his obligation, he was supposed to do it. It was part of the law, but he had the option to refuse it, and then when he did, he would take off his sandal and give it to another person, give it to the other person who could fulfill it, and that was a sign that he was refusing to take his responsibility and offering it then to someone else. Now, this custom is actually described in greater detail in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. It's actually much more interesting what takes place there, in which the Redeemer, in most cases it was supposed to be a brother, but if the brother failed to fulfill his responsibility, then it would move on to someone else to perpetuate the name and the inheritance of the deceased relative. And that the widow would actually then also go to the gate. That's how it's described in Deuteronomy 25. And if that kinsman redeemer failed to fulfill his responsibility, it was actually the woman who would take off the sandal. And then, does anybody know what she does there? Anybody remember that story? Ever have a chance to read it? Then she would spit in his face and say, this is what happens to the person who does not fulfill his brother's house or does not build up his brother's house. Well, they didn't do that. Ruth didn't go there and spit in his face, probably because really they didn't want that to happen. They didn't want to disgrace him. They didn't want anything bad. Boaz just simply wanted him not to fulfill his responsibility. So in this case, Boaz wanted to have Ruth as his wife, and so they did not present it to the gathered elders as a disgraceful act, but rather they simply exchanged the sandal, which was a custom. It was done so that there were witnesses that could see that the transaction had taken place, and no one could come around later and challenge Boaz's right to the land or to Ruth as his wife. Now, there's some speculation here as well as to what exactly this unnamed relative represents. Does he have some kind of spiritual significance? Most commonly, it's said that he represented the law, in that the law was unable to redeem us. The law could not redeem us from the curse of sin. Now, several of the commentaries, or a couple of the commentaries, pointed that out. But I was thinking about that as well, and I talked a lot about typology and illustration and everything like that through this. And I said, sometimes preachers, they have to find spiritual meaning in everything. Can't it just be that the guy took off his sandal and gave it to him and didn't do what he was supposed to do, and that's the end of it? So I don't know if he represents anything at all. Maybe he represents the law, or you can use that and think of it in those terms, or maybe it's just part of the story. Either way, that's just something that has been suggested by some others. So that's what takes place. Then the next thing that we read, that after after that transaction takes place, Boaz then announces to all that are present, everyone there around the city gate, that he would be the one who would fulfill the role of the kinsman redeemer for Ruth and for her mother-in-law Naomi. Now the witnesses then, as they hear this, they acknowledge the marriage and they pronounce a blessing on Boaz and his new wife. They wish that their offspring would be like that from the relationship of Judah and Tamar. Now the reference to that story is also significant. There's an important similarity between the story of Judah and Tamar and Boaz and Ruth. Both of them involve the law of levirate marriage, and I'm going to review a little bit if you're not familiar with the story of Judah and Tamar. But it also involved a story about the levirate marriage, which was where a brother was responsible to marry another brother's. If the brother passed away, his other brother was responsible to marry the widow. And in both cases, the relationships were, to say the least, non-conventional. Now, in the story of Judah and Tamar, we can read that in Genesis 38. We read that Tamar was the wife of Judah's eldest son. Judah, of course, being one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who then they, of course, became the nation of Israel. Judah being the one that eventually took the land near Jerusalem and Bethlehem and where the story is taking place. So, Tamar was the wife of Judah's eldest son. Now, this son lived an evil and sinful life, if we can read in Genesis 38. And he was punished by God, and he died, leaving Tamar a widow. The second son, Judah's second son, however, did not fulfill his responsibilities because he knew that any children that would come from his relationship with Tamar would not be his own legacy, but that of his brother. And he didn't want that to happen. So Judah had a third, youngest child that he promised to Tamar when he reached a certain age. When this third child reached a certain age, then Tamar would be able to marry him. However, Judah, the father-in-law of Tamar, failed to fulfill his promise, failed to give this youngest son to Tamar. So in order to have a son who would care for her in her old age, Tamar played a trick on Judah. And this is where it gets really ugly. As Judah was returning home from a trip, Tamar dressed up as a prostitute, and Judah went to be with her. And then he asked, what do you want in payment? And she said she would like a goat. Well, of course, he wasn't carrying a goat with him. So he said, what would you like to, as a down payment, so to speak, or as Insurance, yeah, that he was going to eventually pay. And so she asked for his signet, which was probably a seal that he would use to identify himself, and a cord. Now, in today's society, asking for that signet would probably be like asking for his driver's license, which to me was kind of a stupid thing to do. But he did it anyway, and obviously he was neither the first nor the last to do a stupid thing because of lust. And so what we read then is, as a result of that relationship, Tamar becomes pregnant with twins. And this is where Judah really messes up too. So 3 months later, the servants announce to Judah that Tamar is pregnant because of being a harlot. And then he has her brought to him, and he's going to have her executed. And he says, who did this? Who was the man that did this? And this is where Tamar takes, she has the upper hand, and she shows the signet, shows the seal and the cord, and he says, the person who owns this. Well, you can just imagine what Judah was thinking and how he felt at that time. He's busted in a big way. He was going to have her executed. He was going to have her put to death. But when his own hypocrisy was found out, then at least he declares that she was more righteous than he. Then one of these two twins was a boy by the name of Perez, and he was then the ancestor of Boaz. And he's brought up in this story. And so as we read more and more, we find out that Perez was probably the father of all the Ephrathites, or Ephratites. When Bethlehem and Ephratah they were either cities that were towns very close together, or it was the same name or same city, different names for the same city. As we look at closer at the genealogies that as they're recorded in the Bible. So Perez was probably the ancestor of all of the residents in that area. And so that's why they said, may your children be as fruitful, and may you have children just like Perez. Now, an important point, which we also brought out in this story here. Oh, sorry, this was the passage where the witnesses said that may it be like the house of Perez. But another important point that we read here, that's just brought out, as I said, here in the 4th chapter, is that the fact of the kinsman redeemer was actually redeeming pieces of land that had been sold or mortgaged by the person who had died. This is all relevant if we understand the importance of the land to the identity of Israel as a nation. So what the Redeemer had to do was not just take the widow and to make her his wife so that he could have the legacy of children, but the land also had to be redeemed and kept within that family block. We know that the land of Israel was part of God's promise to Abraham. And if that Abraham would leave Ur of the Chaldees, God would give him this land that he had promised to him. Then Abraham, we are told, believed God. He traveled hundreds of miles to this land that he had never seen before, and which he was never able to fully possess. However, he was able to occupy small portions of it, and he made sure that he was buried there, he and his wife Sarah. Then we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob has the 12 sons, and during the time of one of his sons, his youngest son Joseph, all of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob left this promised land and went to Egypt, and there they became enslaved for 400 years. However, they never forgot their ties to the land that God had promised them. When God raised up Moses, he led them out of Egypt and brought them back to the land that God had given to them. However, they were not able to possess that land immediately, and they had to wander around for 40 years until all of that generation had passed away and a new generation came up, the generation that refused to enter because of their lack of faith. Then God raised up Joshua to lead the nation in conquest to possess this land. And then after they did enter the land, it was divided among the 12 different tribes, representing these 12 sons of Jacob. And then the areas given to the 12 tribes were subdivided among the clans and the families within those tribes. And these parcels of land were meant to be a possession for these families forever. And they were not to give them up. And if circumstances caused them, like in the case of Naomi, to mortgage the land or to sell the land, there was supposed to be a kinsman redeemer who would buy it. And after 50 years, actually, all of the land would then go back to the original owner. It was that important to them that they kept this legacy of these parcels of land. This concept is summarized in the verse that we have on the slide behind us, in which Joseph says, "And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." And as you read through the Pentateuch, especially in Genesis, you see these promises repeated over and over. They're summarized here in these final verses of the book of Genesis. Now, I think it's a little bit hard for us, as most of us here are urban or suburban people. We didn't grow up on a farm. I didn't grow up on a farm, but my roots really were from farming folks. My father owned a dairy farm, which we moved off of when I was about 4 years old. But on my mother's side, that family, they owned, and it's still owned in the family, a parcel of land in northern Illinois. He was a farmer there. He was a corn farmer. And they owned that land for at least 4 or 5 generations. I don't even know how far back it went. And it was very important to them, that legacy. And every once in a while, if you're riding around in the countryside here, you'll see signs about a homestead farm that's been in the same family for several generations. And for people who have earned their life, their living, and their livelihood off of the land like that, who work the land, that connection to it is very important. Again, we don't really understand it. We buy and sell our houses, and we live in them for a while and then just pass them on to somebody else. And it doesn't have that same significance as somebody who was actually born and raised on that, who earned their food and their living off of that, and then passed it on to the other generation. In fact, the farm that my mother grew up on, it would be her great nephew. It was her brother. They were Norwegians, and the way it worked, their custom was that the property, all of it went to the oldest son. And so one of my cousins to this day is farming that piece of land, and I know that he is planning to pass it on to his son as well. And so that kind of mentality was how it was in Israel. They were that closely tied to the land. Of course, it was a command that God had given to them, so they didn't really have a choice. So the responsibility for the Gaal, we talked about that word a few sermons ago, who was the near relative, he had to redeem that land for the legacy of the family, and it was very important that he would do that. And likewise, it explains today why it is so important for Israel to possess the land that God has given her. Again, I don't think we as Americans really understand what is going on in the Middle East and why this, you hear about the settlements that the Jews are making there in different parts of Palestine, and the battles that are going on there. And we kind of scratch our heads. We can't really wrap our minds around what it means for the Israelites to possess that land. But this is the legacy that God has given to their people. In fact, I was with some of the men from the church on Friday at McDonald's. They gathered together, and we were talking about really what the meaning of Israel returning to the land since World War II, what that really means. Is it some kind of fulfillment of prophecy? Is it the result of direct divine intervention, or is it just natural, what has taken place in history? And on the one hand, we know, and if you've been in Sunday school where John is talking about the prophets, we know that the Israelites, the Jews coming to Israel in the modern state of Israel is not that gathering together that we read in prophecy. That is going to be by divine intervention. But on the other hand, one cannot deny that what is happening here is in some way has to have some kind of guidance from God. That this land, it's more probably setting the stage for the prophecy that's going to take place. That there will be a land there, it will have an infrastructure, it will be ready so that when that divine intervention takes place, everything can move forward. But this concept of the land was so important. The fact that the kinsman redeemer then had to buy back that land for his relatives. Then we go to the end of this story and we reach what is really the rest of the story. The final verses of Ruth chapter 4 give us the rest of the story. It tells us how Ruth and Boaz got married and had a son. Naomi cared for the child as any grandmother would, and her situation is summarized by the words of the women of the town in Ruth chapter 4, verses 14 and 15, which says this. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel, and may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons has bore him." So Naomi, earlier in the story, if you remember, she described her life as bitter. She felt that she had been cursed by the Lord, perhaps because of the things that she had done. However, as God's plan developed, we saw how he was coordinating the event so as to bring Boaz and Ruth together and in turn blessing Naomi. This happened despite the fact that Naomi had been disobedient by going to Moab, and that her sons also were in disobedience by marrying these Moabite women. Likewise, she tried to manipulate the circumstances to ensure that Ruth was seen by Boaz and that she was trying to force this relationship to happen. So despite all the mistakes she made, God brought everything together to bless her in her old age and to provide for her needs. And this concludes with a theme that I've repeated throughout this series, which is that despite our mistakes, despite our own disobedience, despite our own attempts to force the hand of God through our own plans and schemes, God is able to work things for his good and for his glory. Now, we just can never screw things up bad enough that God cannot somehow recover our lives and provide the peace and the joy that we should have. Just like Naomi and her family did all of these things wrong. They never should have left Bethlehem. They never should have gone to Moab. The boys never should have married these girls. And probably Naomi shouldn't have been so aggressive in trying to make sure that this relationship happened. She was trying to force the hand of God in this case. But God was still able to take it. God was still able to bless her and turn everything over for her good. So the story of Ruth has a happy ending for everyone. Naomi is comfortable and cared for in her old age and has an heir to carry on the legacy of her late husband. Ruth becomes a follower of the one true God. She finds a caring and considerate husband who watches her for the rest of her life. Boaz married a devout woman who loved God and would be devoted to him for life. The child is born who is deeply loved and raised in the nurture of the Lord. But then the last few verses that we read tell the rest of the story. We learn that Obed, the child of Ruth and Boaz, was the grandfather of David, the great king of Israel. Now, for those who were reading the story at that time, in 1150 BC, that was the rest of the story. They knew about David. Obviously, the story was recorded after David had become king, because he's referred to here. And he was well known throughout Israel. And so for them, that was the rest of the story. But now we fast forward 1,100 years, and we go to the first chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, and we read the genealogy of Jesus, who was the long-awaited Messiah of Israel. And now we really see the rest of the story. And we pointed some of this out the first week as well, but I just want to review this. That in the genealogy of Jesus, as it is recorded in Matthew chapter 1, we see the name of Ruth appearing. She is one of 5 women mentioned as the ancestors of the Lord. And each one of those 5 women have something in common. that their relationships and the children that they bore came about through some kind of unconventional circumstances. This is something that's commonly pointed out. You've probably heard messages, sermons, Bible studies about this before. But again, at this particular point, it's significant to review this one more time. The first of the 5 women in the genealogy of Jesus that's mentioned is Tamar. And we already heard the sordid story of how she became the mother of Perez. Clearly unconventional, but God still used that to accomplish his purpose. The second woman in the genealogy is Rahab, who was a prostitute. And if you again remember the story of Rahab, we can read about her in the book of Joshua. She protected the spies that went into Jericho before the Israelites besieged that city and took it over. Now the spies, because Rahab protected them, the spies promised her that she and her family would not be harmed when the attack came, and that was the case. And then Rahab went on to marry an Israelite by the name of Salmon, and we assume that she converted as well, that she came to find the Lord as her God and left the gods of Jericho. And she went on, and she's listed actually as Salmon is listed as the father of Boaz. Now, probably he's a more distant relative, that they skipped a few generations there, but they kept it just to be able to show the direct connection. Because it just, the chronology of it doesn't seem likely that it was, given the fall of Jericho, then you have Tamar marrying Salmon and Salmon having Boaz. It all seems all too close, given what we have there. But we see that he is a direct descendant of Boaz, or the direct ancestor of Boaz, directly in that line. Then the third woman that's listed, of course, is Ruth. We just finished studying her story and how she too was an unconventional relationship in the line of the Jewish Messiah. She was a Gentile, she was a Moabite, she had been widowed and remarried an older man in order to carry on the legacy of her dead husband. And then the fourth woman that is mentioned is Bathsheba, not by name, but it's clear that that's who Matthew is referring to, with whom David committed adultery and then had her husband killed. So finally, the fifth, not mentioned in the verses that you see here, was Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then although she herself was pure and devoted to God, the circumstances around the birth of the Savior would have been scandalous. She having been pregnant before the actual marriage was consummated, all of that would have been a scandal in Nazareth, where she was from. So each of the 4 women mentioned in the genealogy, along with Mary, the mother of Jesus, all their individual stories represent God's power to make things work together for his purposes. Those stories are all representative of what Jesus Christ came to do for us. Because all of us have a story that's messed up in some way. There's always, you've got this nice, beautiful genealogy, but throughout it, you've got something that messed up the order of things. And when Jesus Christ came as the true kinsman redeemer for mankind, he was able to make all of those things right. He was able to take all of those things that are messed up in our life, and he was able to just bring it all together, redeem us from the curse of the sin that had us in bondage, and to make us his children, and to preserve his legacy through faith in him. So as we wrap up the story of Ruth, we are left with the conclusion that Elimelech and Naomi made wrong choices. They disregarded God's will, and Naomi found herself far away from where she should have been. We see, though, that God used those bad circumstances, and when Naomi and Ruth came back to where they belong, God was able to change everything. And so, in conclusion, we just ask ourselves, where do we fit into this story? The story is not over. God is still writing that legacy. Jesus Christ is our kinsman redeemer. He came in the form of flesh. He died on the cross. He paid the penalty for our sins. Are we a part of that story? I believe most of you, I know, I look around you, I've heard your testimonies. I'm not going to give an altar call at this time because I believe and trust that most of you know that Jesus Christ is your Savior. If you don't, now is your opportunity to do that. That puts us into the story. That writes us into the story. But it's not over with yet. Because as we live our life, we still stumble, we make those mistakes. But if we, like Naomi, go back to Bethlehem, do what God asks us to do, God is going to take all of those mistakes, all of those errors, he's going to work them around all for his honor and glory. And I think this is how, as we finish this beautiful, precious, wonderful love story that we have, we also see that it reflects the love story that God has demonstrated to us. Jesus Christ, our kinsman redeemer. And even as it says here, there is always hope in the midst of despair. So that concludes the message. And before I give the benediction, we do have one special event, or one special thing to do. So I would ask that Grace Levere would come forward. I've been told there's something back there. I haven't seen it. Here it is. So, as is our tradition, we have a gift for our graduates as they leave one stage of life and move on to the next. You probably know what it is. You've seen enough of these in the last year. I don't think, as far as I know, there's no surprises here. But anyway, so Grace, tell everyone what your plans are and what you'll be doing in the fall.
So I'm going to be attending Ball State University, and I'm going to be majoring in kinesiology, which is like an exercise science, and hope to go on to get a master's in occupational therapy, or at least that's the plan right now, because who knows, I'll change my mind.
Okay. So kinesiology, that's the body. So
Yeah.
She's been doing a lot of that for the last several years with the jump rope and all that kind of thing. So she'll get to know all the physics of what happens when all those things start moving, right?
So I'll only be like an hour away, and hopefully I'll be back.
Okay. So let's just give Grace a round of applause. Let's have a word of prayer. Our gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for Grace and for her life. We thank you for she's been a part of this church since her birth, has with her family faithfully participated in so many things and been able to reflect your love and your glory. We thank you that she is your child and that she desires to serve you through the direction that you take her in life. We pray, Lord, that you will be with her as she goes off to college in a few weeks. We pray and ask, Lord, that you would guide her and direct her to good Christian fellowship while she's there, that she would be able to serve you in that context, watch over her, protect her, help her to be a witness and a testimony for you. We pray that as she moves away from her family, that she would be able to embrace her love for you more and more, that she would be able to grow in her faith and in her boldness, and it would strengthen her so that she would truly shine as a light for the gospel in that environment. Again, we thank you for bringing her through to this point, through her graduation and all that has led up to this, and her activities with jump roping and everything else that she's done throughout her high school years. And we again just pray that you would bless her. And now may the love of God